A historical pattern responsible for the downfall of three major governments within the past 250 years is currently unfolding in the United States in the year 2025. We are meticulously following this precise sequence of events, grievance by grievance, as if reading from a script etched in bloodshed and pandemonium. In 1789, France stood as Europe's preeminent power, a nation of considerable wealth, sophisticated culture, and advanced development. Within a mere 5 years, its government was dismantled. The king met his end at the scaffold, and the nation plunged into a period of terror during which 40,000 individuals were executed for perceived political transgressions. In 1917, Russia comprised a sprawling empire governed by a Tsar who held dominion over 180 million souls. Its military had recently participated in the First World War, and within 8 months the entire imperial structure crumbled. The Tsar was executed, the Bolsheviks seized control, and the ensuing civil war and purges claimed the lives of 20 million people. In 1959, Cuba was a thriving Caribbean nation, attracting American tourists, boasting vibrant casinos, and possessing a functional economy. Within 2 years, Fidel Castro orchestrated a governmental overthrow, nationalized all assets, and transformed the island into a communist dictatorship that endured for 60 years. 3 times, 3 revolutions, 3 instances where seemingly stable administrations collapsed into disarray. And each time, those in positions of authority remained oblivious, convinced of their invincibility and the perpetual subservience of the populace. They erroneously believed the established order was too robust to falter. Their certainty proved to be profoundly misplaced. Today, every warning indicator that preceded those 3 cataclysmic events is palpable within the United States. The chasm of wealth disparity, the pervasive corruption within government, the erosion of trust in established institutions, and the simmering resentment building just beneath the surface. We are not merely approaching this historical trajectory, we are entrenched in stage 4. And the annals of history suggest that stages 5 and 6 arrive with alarming rapidity. This is the narrative of how societal upheavals commence, why governing bodies consistently fail to foresee them, and why statistical probabilities indicate that we are next. Before delving into this pattern, it is crucial to grasp the true definition of a revolution. It is not a mere protest, a riot, or a simple political alteration. A revolution signifies the complete annihilation of the prevailing order and its replacement by something entirely new, often something considerably more oppressive. Revolutions do not stem from poverty. Deprivation has been an enduring human condition throughout history. Instead, they ignite when expectations outstrip reality, when individuals perceive themselves as deserving of a life superior to their current circumstances, and when the gulf between the elite and the general populace widens to such an extreme that the social compact disintegrates. Most critically, revolutions occur when people lose faith in the system's capacity for self-correction, when they cease to believe that the government, the judiciary, or the electoral process will address their legitimate grievances. When peaceful avenues for change are rendered obsolete, violent upheaval becomes an unavoidable consequence. These are not the pronouncements of radical theory, but the precise words of John F. Kennedy. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. History unequivocally substantiates this assertion across every instance. France, Russia, Cuba, 3 distinct centuries, 3 divergent ideologies, yet an identical sequence of 6 stages. Let us examine precisely how this unfolded. We commence with the archetypal modern revolution, named France, in 1789. During the 1780s, France was the epicenter of European civilization. Paris reigned as the global cultural capital, and French was the lingua franca of diplomacy, the arts, philosophy, and science, all of which were flourishing. King Louis XVI occupied the throne, the monarchical lineage having governed France for 8 centuries, an establishment that appeared immutable and unassailable. However, beneath this veneer of stability, decay was absolute. This marks the first stage of every revolution. egregious wealth inequality. In 1789, France's population of 27 million was rigidly stratified into three estates. The first estate, the clergy, possessed 10% of the nation's land and was exempt from taxation. The second estate, the nobility, numbering approximately 400,000 individuals, owned 25% of the land and bore virtually no tax burden. The third estate, encompassing the remaining 26 million peasants, laborers, and members of the middle class, held 65% of the land while shouldering the entirety of the tax obligations. Let that disparity sink in. A mere 1.5% of the population contributed no taxes, while 98.5% carried the entire financial weight. This inequity extended beyond taxation. The nobility enjoyed extensive privileges, including the right to hunt on peasant lands and demand gratuitous labor. They resided in opulent palaces, while the peasantry languished in destitution. By 1788, a severe agricultural failure precipitated a dramatic surge in bread prices. Bread constituted 88% of a peasant's expenditures. When its cost doubled, people could no longer afford to eat. Yet the nobility continued to indulge in elaborate five-course meals and host lavish parties at Versailles. The chasm between the affluent and the rest of society was not merely economic, it represented a profound detachment from reality. This brings us to stage 2, governmental corruption and incompetence. King Louis XVI was not inherently malevolent, he was weak and indecisive. France found itself on the brink of bankruptcy due to its involvement in numerous wars, including its crucial support for America in its Revolutionary War. The government was burdened by billions in debt. Louis's proposed solution? Further borrowing, increased taxation on the peasantry, and no reduction in spending. The nobility refused to pay taxes, as did the clergy, and when Louis attempted to implement reforms, they were thwarted because those in power prioritized their privileges over the nation's welfare, preferring to see the country immolated rather than relinquish their advantages. Does this sound familiar? By 1789, France was engulfed in crisis. The government was incapable of servicing its debts, and the populace could not afford basic sustenance. In response, Louis convened the Estates General, a representative assembly that had not been convened in 175 years. He believed it would legitimize new taxation measures. Instead, it served as the catalyst. This marks stage 3, the destruction and radicalization of the middle class. The third estate, which comprised not only peasants but also lawyers, merchants, and educated members of the burgeoning middle class, demanded equal representation. They sought one vote per individual rather than one vote per estate, which granted the nobility and clergy a decisive 2-to-1 advantage. Louis rejected their plea. Consequently, on June 17, 1789, the Third Estate proclaimed itself the National Assembly. They convened in a tennis court, vowing not to disband until France had adopted a constitution. This is the pivotal moment when the middle class, the educated segment of society expected to uphold the existing order, turns against it. When legal professionals and business owners declare the government illegitimate, revolution becomes an almost inevitable outcome. On July 14, 1789, Parisian citizens stormed the Bastille prison, a potent symbol of royal authority. They killed the guards, parading their severed heads on pikes through the streets. The revolution had commenced and its escalation was swift. This denotes stage 4, the erosion of faith in institutions. The monarchy, the church, and the judicial system all forfeited their credibility. The National Assembly abolished feudalism, confiscated church lands, and proclaimed the rights of man. However, these measures proved insufficient. Radical factions continued to exert pressure. This leads to stage 5. The revolutionary movement garners widespread support. The Jacobins, under the leadership of Robespierre, advocated for more extreme measures. They demanded the execution of the king, the wholesale redistribution of wealth, and the purging of perceived enemies of the revolution. Their radical agenda found traction among the populace, largely because the moderate factions had failed to deliver tangible improvements. The economy remained in turmoil, food scarcity persisted, and the public clamored for decisive, albeit brutal, action. On January 21, 1793, King Louis XVI was publicly executed by guillotine. His wife, Marie Antoinette, met the same fate in October, followed by the onset of the Reign of Terror. This ushers in stage 6. The government is overthrown and chaos ensues. From 1793 to 1794, the Committee of Public Safety, under Robespierre's command, executed 40,000 individuals, including nobles, priests, political adversaries, and even fellow revolutionaries deemed insufficiently radical. They termed this the purification of the revolution. In reality, it was mass extermination. The guillotine operated daily in Paris, its public executions serving as a grim spectacle. The purges expanded relentlessly, initially targeting the nobility, then moderate revolutionaries, and ultimately anyone accused of harboring counter-revolutionary sentiments. Trials and evidence were rendered irrelevant. Mere accusation sufficed for condemnation and death. Robespierre himself ultimately fell victim to the very system he established, a testament to the adage that revolutions invariably consume their own progeny. By 1799, France was utterly exhausted. 10 years of anarchy, economic collapse, and pervasive warfare had taken their toll. Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup d'état, ultimately crowning himself emperor. The revolution, which had been proclaimed with ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, concluded with a military dictatorship that plunged Europe into 15 years of conflict. The overarching lesson from the French experience is this: extreme inequality, compounded by governmental incompetence and a profound loss of faith in established institutions, inevitably precipitates revolution, which in turn leads to widespread chaos, terror, and frequently a form of dictatorship more severe than the preceding regime. Now let us advance 128 years to Russia in 1917. By 1917, Russia was a technologically backward empire ruled by Tsar Nicholas II. The Romanov dynasty had held sway for 3 centuries, and Russia itself was a vast territory spanning from Europe to the Pacific and encompassing 180 million inhabitants. Yet, beneath this imperial grandeur lay the familiar seeds of decay. This marks stage 1, extreme wealth inequality. The Tsar and the nobility possessed virtually all the wealth, while the peasantry, constituting 80% of the population, owned nothing. Although emancipated from serfdom in 1861, most peasants continued to labor on land owned by nobles burdened by unaffordable rent payments. In urban centers, factory workers endured 12 to 14-hour workdays for subsistence wages, with child labor being a common practice and safety regulations virtually non-existent. Meanwhile, the Tsar resided in opulent palaces, and the nobility hosted extravagant balls, the cost of which could exceed a peasant's lifetime earnings. This disparity transcended economics. It was a feudal, antiquated system that was fundamentally unsustainable. This leads to stage 2, governmental corruption and incompetence. Tsar Nicholas II proved to be an inept ruler, characterized by weakness, indecisiveness, and a complete detachment from the realities faced by his people. He adhered to the doctrine of divine right, believing he had been divinely chosen to rule, thus rendering any form of reform unnecessary. When workers staged a peaceful march to the Winter Palace in 1905 to petition for improved working conditions, his guards opened fire, resulting in hundreds of casualties. This event, known as Bloody Sunday, irrevocably shattered any remaining trust that the Tsar cared for his subjects. Subsequently, Russia entered the First World War in 1914, an undertaking that proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Millions of inadequately equipped soldiers were dispatched to their deaths. The officer corps exhibited gross incompetence, supply lines disintegrated, and soldiers fought without ammunition, with entire divisions surrendering due to a lack of basic resources. By 1917, Russia had sustained 3 million casualties. Its army was in a state of widespread desertion, and its economy was in collapse. Amidst this turmoil, the Tsar continued to live in luxury, relying on the counsel of Rasputin, a mystical figure who exerted considerable influence over the imperial family. In February 1917, bread riots erupted in Petrograd, the capital. Women participating in bread lines initiated protests, which soon garnered the support of factory workers. The army was deployed to restore order, but the soldiers refused to fire on the assembled crowds, leading to a mutiny. This constitutes stage 3. The middle class and military turn against the government. When the armed forces refuse to defend the state, its collapse is imminent. The Duma, Russia's parliamentary body, demanded Nicholas's abdication. On March 15, 1917, he complied, bringing an end to the 300-year Romanov dynasty, not with a bang, but a whimper. A provisional government assumed power, led by Alexander Kerensky. They pledged reforms, elections, and the establishment of a constitution. However, they committed a fatal error by persisting in Russia's involvement in the First World War. The soldiers yearned for peace, and the populace demanded food. The provisional government failed to deliver on either front. This leads to stage 4, the erosion of faith in institutions. The provisional government lost its legitimacy within months, perceived as weak, incompetent, and beholden to foreign powers. Into this vacuum stepped Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. This marks stage 5. The revolutionary movement garners widespread support. Lenin articulated 3 core promises: peace, land, and bread. End the war, redistribute the nobility's land to the peasants, and feed the populace. These were simple, direct appeals that resonated deeply. The Bolsheviks cultivated a disciplined revolutionary organization poised to seize power. On October 25, 1917, the Bolsheviks executed a coup. They stormed the Winter Palace, arrested the members of the provisional government, and Lenin proclaimed Soviet power. The entire operation was completed in less than 24 hours with minimal bloodshed. However, what followed was far from peaceful. This signifies stage 6. The government is overthrown and chaos ensues. The Russian Civil War raged from 1918 to 1922, pitting the Bolsheviks, the Reds, against a disparate coalition of opposition forces, the Whites, including monarchists, liberals, and foreign interventionists. It was an all-consuming conflict. The Bolsheviks ultimately prevailed through relentless terror. The Cheka, their secret police, executed anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activities. Entire villages were annihilated. In July 1918, the Tsar and his entire family were executed in a basement, shot and bayoneted, including the children. By 1922, the Bolsheviks controlled Russia, but at a devastating cost. 10 million lives were lost in the Civil War, and famine claimed millions more. The economy was in ruins. Lenin's promises proved hollow. Peace translated to a humiliating surrender to Germany. Land signified forced collectivization and famine, and bread meant rationing and starvation. The revolution that had promised liberation ultimately delivered dictatorship. Stalin ascended to power in 1924 and was responsible for the deaths of an additional 20 million people through purges and manufactured famines. The critical lesson from Russia is this: when governmental incompetence intersects with military defeat and the emergence of a disciplined revolutionary organization, the entire societal structure can collapse with astonishing speed, and the successor regime is frequently far more brutal. Now let us examine the most recent historical precedent, Cuba in 1959. This case is distinct because Cuba was not a backward agrarian society. In the 1950s, it was a relatively prosperous nation. Cuba boasted one of the highest standards of living in Latin America. Havana was famously dubbed the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean, a hub of tourism, casinos, and significant American investment. However, beneath this veneer of affluence, the familiar pattern persisted. This is stage 1, extreme wealth inequality. Wealth was concentrated in Havana and among the elite circles connected to the regime of President Fulgencio Batista. The rural poor, particularly in eastern Cuba, endured abject poverty. Sugar plantations dominated the economy, with American corporations owning substantial tracts of land. The profits generated were either repatriated abroad or funneled into the coffers of a select few. Meanwhile, rural Cubans lacked access to healthcare, education, and basic opportunities. The disparity between Havana's glamorous nightlife and the impoverished countryside was immense. This leads to stage 2, governmental corruption and incompetence. Batista was a dictator who had seized power in a 1952 coup. He abrogated elections and ruled by decree, presiding over a regime rife with pervasive corruption. The police were easily bribed and the courts were manipulated. Political opponents were routinely imprisoned or assassinated. American organized crime figures operated the casinos with Batista's tacit approval, sharing a portion of their illicit gains with him. The government's sole purpose was to enrich Batista and his cronies, serving no other function. When citizens protested, the response was invariably brutal, involving secret police, torture, and enforced disappearances. This fostered widespread resentment, particularly among young, educated Cubans who witnessed their nation being plundered. This constitutes stage 3. The middle class becomes radicalized. Fidel Castro, a lawyer from a comparatively affluent background, possessed the education and potential to integrate into the elite. However, he recognized the rampant corruption and opted for revolution. In 1953, he led an assault on the Moncada barracks, an action that ultimately failed. He was subsequently imprisoned. Yet during his trial, he delivered a powerful speech that resonated with thousands. "History will absolve me," he declared. He was released in a 1955 amnesty and proceeded to Mexico to organize his movement. In December 1956, Castro returned to Cuba with 82 followers aboard a vessel named the Granma. They landed in eastern Cuba, where they were ambushed by Batista's forces. Only 20 survived, escaping into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Most revolutionary leaders would have surrendered at this point, but Castro persevered. This is where the pattern accelerates. This marks stage 4, the erosion of faith in institutions. Batista's relentless brutality alienated the populace, driving more individuals to support the rebels. When the army indiscriminately torched villages suspected of aiding the insurgents, it only served to generate new recruits for Castro's cause. When the police subjected students to torture, their classmates invariably joined the revolution. Castro's forces swelled not due to ideological appeal, but because Batista was universally despised. Concurrently, the United States, which had previously supported Batista, began to distance itself from his regime. When a nation's foreign patron withdraws its support, its downfall becomes increasingly probable. This leads to stage 5. The revolutionary movement garners widespread support. By 1958, Castro commanded thousands of fighters, established urban resistance networks in every major city, and enjoyed the backing of peasants who viewed him as their protector. Batista's army began to disintegrate, with soldiers deserting in droves and officers fleeing the country with stolen funds. On January 1st, 1959, Batista absconded to the Dominican Republic, taking with him $300 million. Castro triumphantly entered Havana on January 8th. This signifies stage 6. The government is overthrown and chaos ensues. Initially, Castro pledged democratic reforms, free elections, and an unfettered press. However, within months, his true intentions became apparent. Political opponents were arrested, subjected to summary trials, and executed. The press was systematically censored, and Cuba transformed into a communist dictatorship. Castro proceeded to nationalize all industries, including factories, farms, and businesses. Anyone who resisted was imprisoned or executed. Hundreds were shot in the first year alone, and thousands fled the island. The middle class, which had initially supported Castro due to their antipathy towards Batista, discovered too late that revolution does not usher in freedom, but rather new oppressors. Cuba remained a dictatorship for 60 years, with Fidel ruling until 2008 and his brother Raúl governing until 2018. The revolution that had promised liberation ultimately imposed poverty and repression. The crucial lesson from Cuba is this: even in a relatively developed nation, entrenched corruption and brutality can ignite a revolution, and the revolutionaries, once in power, invariably become the new oppressors. 3 revolutions, 3 distinct nations, 3 different centuries: France in 1789, Russia in 1917, and Cuba in 1959. Despite their divergent contexts and ideologies, they all followed the identical six-stage pattern. Let us dissect this progression, for once you comprehend it, you will understand why the events transpiring in the United States today should fill you with profound apprehension. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. In all three instances, wealth was concentrated in the hands of a minuscule elite, while the masses struggled for survival. In France, the nobility and clergy were tax-exempt. In Russia, the Tsar and nobles owned virtually everything. In Cuba, Batista and his associates systematically plundered the nation. While the precise figures varied, the underlying pattern remained consistent. When the top 1% controls between 25 and 40% of a nation's wealth, and when the disparity between the rich and the poor becomes ostentatiously evident and insulting, resentment invariably festers. This factor alone does not precipitate revolution. Inequality has always been a pervasive element of human society. However, it serves as the foundational bedrock. Check. Stage 2. Governmental corruption and incompetence. In all three cases, the governing bodies were perceived as illegitimate. France's King Louis XVI was incapable of enacting reforms and resorted to continuous borrowing. Russia's Nicholas II was incompetent and utterly disconnected from the realities of his subjects' lives. Cuba's Batista was a corrupt dictator. When a government exists solely to benefit the elite, when corruption is blatant, and when incompetence leads to widespread crisis, public respect for authority erodes. Check. Stage 3. The middle class is destroyed and radicalized. This is the critical stage. Revolutions do not originate with the poorest segments of society. They emerge when the educated middle class loses hope in the existing system. In France, lawyers and merchants spearheaded the National Assembly. In Russia, students and intellectuals aligned with the Bolsheviks. In Cuba, Castro himself was a lawyer, and many of his initial supporters were educated urban dwellers. When the individuals who are expected to benefit most from stability begin to oppose it, revolution becomes highly probable. Check. Stage 4. The erosion of faith in institutions. When citizens cease to believe in the efficacy of elections, the impartiality of courts, or the integrity of law enforcement, the fundamental social contract is broken. In France, the Estates General transformed into a revolutionary assembly. In Russia, soldiers refused to defend the Tsar. In Cuba, it was common knowledge that Batista manipulated election outcomes. When institutions lose their credibility and the populace concludes that the system cannot be reformed from within, they seek alternatives outside its framework. This represents the point of no return. Check. Stage 5. The revolutionary movement garners widespread support. This is when organized factions present a viable alternative. In France, it was the Jacobins. In Russia, the Bolsheviks. In Cuba, Castro's July 26th movement. They offer promises of justice, retribution against the corrupt, and a brighter future. Desperate for change, people rally behind them, not out of affection for the revolutionaries, but out of a profound animosity towards the incumbent government. Check. Stage 6. The government is overthrown, and chaos ensues. This is the culmination of the process. The old order collapses. In France, the king was beheaded, leading to the reign of terror. In Russia, the Tsar was executed, triggering a civil war that claimed millions of lives. In Cuba, Batista fled, and Castro established himself as dictator. Herein lies a pattern within the pattern. The revolution never delivers on its promises. Instead, it brings bloodshed, purges, and the emergence of new forms of tyranny. This is because revolutions are invariably led by extremists, and extremists are driven by destruction rather than construction. The moderate voices advocating for reform are either executed or exiled. The individuals who anticipated that revolution would bring freedom discover to their profound regret that the ensuing chaos is a far greater evil than the preceding corruption. Let's consider the present-day United States in the year 2025 and examine the alarming indicators suggesting an impending crisis. We begin with the initial phase, profound economic disparity. This is clearly evident. In 1980, the wealthiest 1% of Americans controlled 8% of the nation's wealth. Today, that figure stands at 32%, exceeding the imbalance seen in France in 1789. The top 0.1%, comprising approximately 130,000 households, now possesses more wealth than the bottom 90%, representing around 117 million households. The chasm separating the ultra-rich from the rest of the population is wider than at any point in American history, surpassing even the disparities of the Gilded Age and the 1920s. The affluence of the wealthy is ostentatious, displayed through private jets, opulent yachts, and excursions into space. Meanwhile, the middle class struggles to afford basic necessities like housing, healthcare, and education. Millions are forced to hold multiple jobs simply to subsist. This escalating discontent is understandable and growing. The subsequent phase involves governmental dysfunction and widespread corruption. This too is a stark reality. Public trust in the legislative branch hovers at a mere 15%. Confidence in the Supreme Court is rapidly eroding. A significant portion of the population believes that electoral processes are compromised. Members of Congress engage in pervasive insider trading, and legislative agendas are frequently dictated by lobbyists. Corporations wield considerable influence over elected officials, leading to governmental paralysis. Critical infrastructure is deteriorating. The national debt has ballooned to $36 trillion and continues to climb. Essential issues remain unresolved because the government appears to prioritize the interests of its financial backers over the needs of its citizens. When both major political parties are perceived as corrupt and ineffective, and when citizens lose faith in the integrity of the electoral system, the very foundations of democracy begin to crumble. The third stage sees the decimation and radicalization of the middle class. This process is well underway. The American middle class is being systematically hollowed out. The cost of higher education is prohibitive. Home ownership is increasingly unattainable. Medical expenses are driving families into financial ruin. Wage increases have stagnated while the value of assets has soared. Young individuals, even those with advanced degrees, are unable to achieve the level of financial security their parents attained. They are burdened by student loan debt, unable to purchase homes or start families, and are understandably resentful. When professionals such as lawyers, educators, and engineers, who are typically expected to thrive, find themselves struggling, they become susceptible to radical ideologies. They seek scapegoats, often identifying the elite, billionaires, or the established system as the source of their grievances. This is the fertile ground for societal upheaval, often initiated not by the poorest, but by educated individuals who feel their aspirations have been betrayed. The fourth stage is characterized by a profound loss of confidence in societal institutions. We are currently witnessing this phenomenon. Public trust in the media has plummeted to unprecedented lows. Confidence in law enforcement has collapsed. Faith in the electoral process is shattered. A substantial segment of the population maintains that the 2020 election was fraudulent, while an equally significant portion views the events of January 6, 2021 as an attempted coup. Neither side trusts the other, and neither side believes in the legitimacy of established institutions. The judiciary is perceived as politically motivated, as is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every issue is viewed through a partisan lens. When this polarization takes hold, and when citizens cease to believe in shared institutions, national unity disintegrates. The country effectively fractures into two distinct entities occupying the same territory, awaiting a catalyst. France experienced the Estates General, Russia had Bloody Sunday, and Cuba suffered under Batista's tyranny. In America, the spark could manifest in various forms: a disputed election, an economic collapse, a political assassination, or a widely publicized incident involving law enforcement. The conditions are ripe for an explosion. We are merely awaiting the ignition. We are currently in Stage 4, and historical precedent indicates that Stage 5 is the inevitable progression. Stage 5 involves a revolutionary movement garnering widespread support. While this has not yet occurred in its entirety, the groundwork is being laid. On the political left, there is a growing endorsement of socialist policies, wealth redistribution, and anti-elite rhetoric. On the right, support is increasing for authoritarianism, strongman leadership, and extra-legal measures. Both ideological extremes increasingly believe that the existing system is beyond repair and requires complete dismantling and reconstruction. When moderate voices lose their influence and extremist factions gain broad public traction, Stage 5 has arrived. We are closer to this point than many people realize. Stage 6 is the outcome that most prefer not to contemplate, for Stage 6 signifies utter chaos. In France, the reign of terror resulted in 40,000 executions. In Russia, a civil war claimed 10 million lives. Cuba has endured 60 years of dictatorship. The notion of American exceptionalism suggests that such a fate is impossible for the United States, citing our stability, wealth, and democratic traditions. However, this was the same belief held in France. Russia was a centuries-old empire. Cuba was once a prosperous and modern nation. All three eventually succumbed to upheaval. History's patterns are indifferent to claims of exceptionalism. What might Stage 6 entail for America? The precise form is uncertain, but historical examples offer insights. Political violence would escalate, not merely as isolated riots, but as organized acts of aggression, including assassinations and insurgencies. The military and law enforcement agencies would fracture, with some units siding with the established government and others aligning with revolutionary forces. Supply chains would collapse, leading to widespread food and fuel shortages. The economy would disintegrate due to a complete breakdown of trust. Individual states might attempt to secede or defy federal authority, and foreign powers, such as China and Russia, would likely exploit the chaos to their advantage. This period of turmoil could persist for years, resulting in millions of casualties. The eventual outcome would be an America unrecognizable from its past, potentially evolving into an authoritarian state, fragmenting into regional entities, or becoming something far worse. This is the grim prospect of Stage 6, and the historical pattern suggests that once a nation enters Stage 4, extrication becomes exceptionally difficult. Three distinct revolutions, those in France, Russia, and Cuba, followed remarkably similar trajectories. In each instance, the ruling elites were blindsided, believing themselves secure and underestimating the potential for popular uprising. In each case, the confluence of extreme wealth disparity, governmental corruption, and a pervasive erosion of public trust culminated in an explosive event that dismantled the existing order. The United States is currently situated in Stage 4. The wealth gap exceeds that of France in 1789. The government exhibits a level of dysfunction comparable to Russia in 1917. The public's faith in institutions mirrors the broken trust seen in Cuba in 1958. The historical pattern strongly indicates that stages 5 and 6 are imminent. Perhaps intervention is still possible, perhaps reform can precede revolution, or the system might possess an inherent capacity for self-correction. However, the historical record offers a starkly different prognosis. The warnings are undeniable, evident in every facet of our society. 3 times this pattern has unfolded. Each time, the established powers believed themselves unique and immune. Each time, the inexorable pattern prevailed. If this analysis has illuminated your understanding of our current position within this cycle, please subscribe. For when Stage 5 commences and revolutionary movements begin to gain widespread traction, you will need to comprehend the unfolding events and their underlying causes. The answers are not concealed in the future. They are clearly inscribed in the annals of the past.